Welcome everyone to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how things in Montpelier shake out for the rest of us. And I want to welcome regular contributor Emily Kornheiser. So glad to have you again today
on
the show. I thought I should probably finish that sentence better. And John Walters is joining us from the Montpelier area on this at least snowy day down in Windham County. So glad you can be joining us. For those who don't know, John Walters is a journalist and blogger behind the website, the Vermont Political Observer. So glad you can join us today, John.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I was feeling yesterday when I asked John to be on the show, I think I was feeling just a little bit nostalgic with December, has started, 2021's kind of starting to come to an end. And I was just thinking about everything we've been through. And this year, which I think we had in 2020 been so optimistic that the pandemic would be over and things would be done and we'd be in this whole new world again.
Everyone would be
a whole new world.
Yes, there would be a different new world. We were gonna, yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we did get a new world, but not quite the one we expected. And I just was really curious about hearing from John and Emily about what this year has meant for them and what are some of the big stories or events and kind of what are they looking for with the session opening again in January, which is not that far away. So I'd love to start with you, Emily. Where's your heart and mind these days?
I think my heart and mind is in a really similar place to a lot of other people I know, where I feel very aware that this time calls for big, bold thinking and optimism and creativity. And I am really tired, and I have not made time for the grief that is needed to move towards creativity. I have not made the time for whatever the wintering of my soul or whatever. I have not made time for what I need to do to move into that really creative space. And frankly, I know that I'm really concerned about what that means for January, not just for me, but for me and all my colleagues.
Yeah,
I think that for maybe the first time in quite a while, we have this political momentum and moment and money to think big and think strategic. And we're seeing that modeled on the federal level. And we know what those things are and places are that we want to think bold and brave and transformative. And I'm tired, and the Legislative Council staff is tired, and the Joint Fiscal Office staff is tired, and leadership is tired. And we need to, and I'm not saying that for sympathy, I'm saying it because it is like a systemic problem through all of government that might keep us from doing what we need to do right now. And pushing harder and faster isn't going to fix it.
Yeah, I was feeling last night after I got off the phone with John, I was thinking about how much, as odd as this sounds, I actually missed the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 because granted, we were all terrified, but we had so much focus and we were like, we are solving problems here, people. And we did on so many levels, and we came together so deeply as a community, I think, in so many ways. And understandably, that is hard to maintain, that kind of level of laser focus that I think we had early in the pandemic to tackle so many problems at once. And yet I'm kind of missing that because I feel we need that now. We need to have that focus again or that level of energy and that belief that we can surmount these problems. And yet, honestly, for very good reasons, we're tired.
Well, and I just want to add one thing before you jump in, John. I'm sorry. You
You're
know,
being very patient, John.
those of us who are well acclimated or tend towards performing very well in a crisis because of our families of origin or our genetics or whatever it is, you know, folks who like food service, folks who like journalism, folks who like politics, like that hum actually causes better performance, right? I think those of us who are like that really thrived in those 6 months. We were solving the problems for our communities. We were
We
making
had
things
purpose.
happen. We had so much purpose and so much like that focus, that like humming focus of a crisis is just like, it feels so good. And it is actually not sustainable. No one's ever thought it was sustainable. That's why chronic poverty, that's one of the reasons chronic poverty causes PTSD. Like it's not like our synapses aren't capable of it. It's not something you can push through.
I think the Delta variant has been the big sucker punch in all of this. You know, we had a year of COVID and it slowly got better. And, you know, the spring came and it started to look like maybe we were getting close to being normal again. You know, I thought about getting a haircut for the first time in a year. And maybe even, you know, going back to my favorite restaurant for the first time in a year. And then the Delta variant hit, and it's just been a steady downhill in Vermont from there. And a loss of, for me and for people who are paying close attention, I think, a loss of trust in the Scott administration to do what's right, which they did, you know, abundantly during the first year of the pandemic. And since the Delta variant came, it's been pretty bleak. I mean, not horrible, but sort of a steady drip, drip, drip of, you know, higher case counts and, you know, more hospitalizations. And, you know, for the legislature, like, aside from all the big issues you're going to face, just wondering what the session is going to look like. You know, are you going to be in Montpelier? Will you feel safe being in the State House? How are they going to manage crowds and all that stuff? So, you know, that is the underlying you know, the foundation of tension and angst and fatigue that we don't normally have. And, you know, I can't overemphasize enough Emily's first point, which is we have a historic opportunity in Vermont with the federal COVID money. We suddenly have enough money to do some things that we have wanted to do for a long time. You know, provide more housing and, you know, universal broadband and, you know, real progress on climate. And we have the money to do those things, and it's not going to be there forever. You know, the federal money will ebb sooner or later. And this is an opportunity we can't afford to miss.
So, John, looking back on 2021, what have been the either issues or topics or events that have really stood out for you that you've been keeping an eye on?
Well, it's hard to keep an eye on anything other than COVID. You know, especially once the Delta variant made clear that it was not going away anytime soon. I have started, you know, faithfully monitoring all of the governor's weekly COVID briefings, which run roughly 2 hours apiece. And I have been pretty uniformly disappointed in the performance of the administration. Their shading of the truth, their insistence on not changing course, you know, the kind of flubbed rollout of the test to stay program in the schools. And, you know, lately the governor's obvious impatience with criticism. You know, at the last briefing, he multiple times basically told people to stop criticizing him. You know, that it was doing more harm than good. It was just making the problem worse. It was causing more tension and more controversy. And, you know, I'm sorry, but people who disagree with you, Governor, are honestly disagreeing with you. They're not just playing politics. They're not trying to stir up trouble. You know, the media isn't in this for the clicks. We're trying to tell the story. And unfortunately for the governor, the story isn't all good news for him, as it was for the first year.
Mhm.
So, and I realize, like, the couple of polls that we have show that he's still very popular. I don't doubt that, but I think he risks losing his political mojo over the pandemic if this continues indefinitely. And, you know, it looks like things are going to keep getting worse for at least another couple of months.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And by then we'll be facing Omicron with whatever that will bring. Hospitals are packed to the brim, and, you know, it's not good.
You know, I
So
think
John, Emily, sorry, I just want to jump in there quickly and go back to something John said, because I want to be clear about it. You talked about the governor's shading of the truth. Could you just unpack that a little bit? Because I think that those are big words coming from a journalist.
Yes. Well, they always present the statistics that make them look better and downplay the ones that don't. You know, an example of that I can recall, because it's from this week, was Education Secretary Dan French talking about the Test to Stay program, and which, you know, the administration rolled out very late after the beginning of the school year,
Mhm.
and they've been playing catch up ever since. And, you know, he talked about how 73% of the school districts are enrolled in Test to Stay. And that sounds good-ish, although I'd say 3 months into the school year, more districts ought to be signed up. But, you know, when he says enrolled, that means that districts either are doing Test to Stay or are preparing to do Test to Stay. And that 3 months in is a situation we should not be in. And, you know, Dan French didn't give a breakdown for how many school districts are actually doing it and how many are just waiting to get started at this point. And the other thing that he announced was that the state is going to, it has contracted with a temporary services agency to provide part-time staff for the school districts to conduct Test to Stay. And this came after like 2 months of the administration insisting that they were not going to do anything for the schools, and the school districts were on their own.
And the school district saying over and over again, we didn't have enough staff capacity before we had to do testing and contact tracing and vaccines.
Yeah, and, you know, they're paying for these temp services with federal COVID relief money. They could have done that 2 months ago, and they chose not to. And, you know, that has, I'm sure, caused a lot of school districts to stay out of the program and to make those who are trying to do it, you know, less than comprehensive. So, you know, he tried to make it sound like Test to Stay is on track, when in fact it's slowly gaining traction. It's still a work in progress. They've clearly decided it's understaffed. It all should have been done earlier. You know, they modeled the program after Massachusetts, and in Massachusetts they started the program in July, at the very beginning of Delta, and the administration waited until sometime in September to start it. So it's kind of like, you know, trying to fix the car engine while you're on the highway. And it's a situation, again, we should not be.
In a time of limited resources is reasonable, but in a time where none of all of this is freely paid for with federal funds is unacceptable.
Yeah, yeah. If they could find the money now, why didn't they find the money, you know, 2 months ago? And, you know, when they contract with a temp agency in mid-November, and the temp agency starts looking for people just before Thanksgiving, that means that the districts, by the time the state looks through the resumes and sends them on to the districts, and the districts interview people, you know, it might be the very end of the semester or even January before the districts get any meaningful help. And the other thing is, you know, the administration is wasting a lot of money doing all this temp hiring, because temp agencies are not cheap. You know, and we're hiring tons of people for hospitals. on a temporary basis. And those, traveling nurses are very expensive and the agencies charge high fees.
Mhm.
And I'm sure they're not offering any discounts during this time. So it's been, for the administration, especially the last like 6 months or so, it's been penny wise and pound foolish in a lot of different ways. And the
Okay.
districts and the hospitals and people like me who really don't want to get COVID because we have risk factors. So we stay home all the time. It's disappointing. It's dispiriting. And, that's one more contributing factor to the general fatigue we're all feeling at a moment when we have to gear up and get going.
Mhm. Thank you, John. Emily.
Yeah, towards that idea of shading the truth, I think something that became really clear to me as I was thinking through the conversation we've been having about masking and what a statewide mask rule looks like and what it looks like at a community level is how much people are too tired to pay attention to all the case rates every single day and to navigate their way through all of the different piles of statistics to understand what their danger level is, to understand their own risk level. Was maybe something that everyone felt enough of an emergency push towards at the very beginning of this for people to try to figure out their risk. But at this point, everyone is too tired to try to figure out their risk. And state policy, such as a mask rule, doesn't just serve to protect people because people are wearing masks. It serves as a signal that there is danger and that someone is monitoring that danger. And so when the danger is minimized in order to sort of calm the waters and prop the economy and make politicians feel and look better about the job they've been doing, that serves as misinformation. It really creates misinformation in communities at a time when people do not have the bandwidth to find their own information.
Yeah, that's a prime example of the governor shading the truth, or somewhere between shading the truth and actually lying, is his continued insistence that a mask mandate would not have any effect, that nobody would wear a mask just because it's mandated.
Mhm.
And, that's just simply not true. The public health experts will tell you that's not true. A mandate wouldn't be 100% effective, but if you got like 20% more people wearing masks, that would be a good thing. And I think we could expect at least that much. And, for him to stand up there and say it wouldn't do any good is just not true.
Mhm. Mhm. Emily, what are some of the big issues or events or news stories that have stood out for you this year?
I think we've seen a transformation in our conversation around housing.
Mm,
That isn't just a transformation in the conversation, but is leading to real change. I think both the amount of emphasis on the shift and the opening of GA motel rules, and I feel like we're almost on the other side of winning that debate. After having it for 5 years, it's not, or 50, but it's certainly not a debate that started during the pandemic. And many of us have been very focused on it for quite a long period of time. And so I'm really grateful to the homeless services organizations that have been wading through a morass of COVID, not COVID, conversations around that. That feels like a transformative conversation that's actually borne fruit. The conversation about building permanent housing and how to navigate zoning and NIMBYism and wastewater and all of that, that feels like both a transformative shift in frame and a place that money is going. So that feels fantastic. I think there's been a transformation in how we talk about women in work and how we talk about the burdens on families of working. I have not seen us yet put our money or our policy where that is. We're still debating the details or deferring to the feds on family medical leave. I think there's a lot of small things we could do right now that would make a difference, and I'm hopeful that we will this year. Childcare is still stretched beyond belief, and some of it is problems that money won't solve, or money won't solve in the short term. though we have made significant strides on that. What I thought would happen and felt very, very present or alive through this was worker protections and workers' rights, both from the perspective of how unemployment insurance is handled in Vermont, what workplace safety looks like from an OSHA, occupational safety and health perspective, what reliable work schedules like that. All of that has been so much talked about, but it seems like the frame now is the Great Resignation and what are we going to do about the workforce shortage, not what would it take to transform our workplaces so that people don't resign.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's so much we can do and so many bills on the wall that would make huge strides in that. And we're not doing that yet. But those are, I think, and I'm not gonna talk about the abortions today, I don't think, but that's certainly I think we should do a different show on that very soon. Maybe once like the heart's a little recovered from yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I had a little cry this morning listening to that coverage. Yes.
I just kind of tuned it out because I didn't think I could take it. It's so dispiriting. And it's something we don't experience directly here, I might suggest to the Travel and Tourism Department that, 20 years ago, we did a land office business in, civil unions, travel packages to get a civil union. Now we can have travel packages for people in the deep South to get abortions.
Also, joking aside.
Progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of heartache
Joking
there.
aside, and I think we're going to do a whole show on this. We do have an organization called Vermont Access for Reproductive Freedom. I think they're shortened to Vermont Access now, and they exist explicitly to support abortion access in Vermont, and they partner with abortion access organizations all across the country. There's one in almost every state. And so if you're looking for sort of a local way to get involved in national challenges around access to abortion, Vermont Access is a great place to put your dollars and your energy.
Thank you, Emily.
As well as Planned Parenthood. But if you want something that feels like a little more like
focused,
yes. They pay for transportation for folks to get to abortions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else, Emily? We have, as always, our conversations fly by. And so we only have like 5 minutes left before we have to hear from some underwriters. I'm
sure that something will stand out for me, and I will, I'm sure something will jump to mind later, but no, those are the things that feel the most prescient from this time. And I know that's the wrong word. I don't know why it keeps on coming in, but it's the one I'm using. It works. I think we're with you on it. Okay. Hey, John, before we go to break, are there any non-COVID issues that you could quickly list that kind of have been on your radar?
Well, one big one that's going to hit the legislature in January is the Vermont Climate Council just issued its report and its recommendations. I guess it's stronger than recommendations because the state is legally bound to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act targets now. Mm-hmm. So the legislature is going to face a real challenge with wrestling with that very long and very detailed report and all its suggestions, recommendations, mandates, whatever you want to call them. And it's clear that they're facing an administration that is going to be not terribly interested in taking strong action on the climate. The 4 cabinet secretaries on the Climate Council all voted no on the final report. And that's as much of a signal as anybody should need that, the governor is going to be willing to spend money on climate because we've got the federal money. We'll have to spend it smartly. But beyond that, the administration has made it clear they don't like the Global Warming Solutions Act. They don't agree with it. They think it's actually unconstitutional. And I don't see any reason to think that Governor Scott is going to be friendly toward anything the legislature does on climate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Emily, quickly, any non-COVID issues you want to highlight?
Coming for the year or from last year?
The last year, 2021.
You know, I think we have grappled with race in some really profound ways. It's been powerful and meaningful to see how much will my colleagues have to engage in those conversations. It's still not clear to me what the other side of that is, what transformation looks like for that. I'm excited that we've started to shift beyond just conversations about race and criminal justice, because criminal justice reform is not the only thing you can do on issues of race, and really started to think about this in the context of every committee's work. And I actually think the Global Warming Solutions Act and the work that the Climate Council did has some really great implications there. So that's a big one, is that what is it going to take to really shift that conversation in Vermont, especially, where I think so much of what we're proud of here is sometimes just actually an accident of our whiteness. And we've talked about that in the context of sort of housing and NIMBYism and a bunch of other stuff before, but I think that's going to be an interesting part of the conversation as we move forward.
Thank you. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment, so don't go anywhere, folks. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television, as well as our iTunes page and our Captivate page as well. And I think, yes, you can even find us on Facebook. We're just kind of wherever people will let us in, we sneak through the door, basically, is what happens. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro and journalist and blogger John Walters, who's in Montpelier. And we are talking about 2021 and looking ahead to 2022. Hey, Emily, what do we need to remind our listeners of?
Well, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and not their employers or the station this is played on or the platforms that might host it, but just the people saying the things.
So, John, we would love to hear you say more things. What are you looking forward to with 2022 and the session starting in January?
Well, I have to say, Emily will probably agree with me. This is going to be a very packed session. You know, we always kind of say that at this time of year, but, you know, aside from whatever the normal flow of legislation is, which usually takes up a lot of time, they're going to have to deal with, you know, the Climate Council report. They have to, I'm sure the legislature will look at COVID policy and masks and all that stuff, despite the governor's opposition. There's all those federal COVID dollars we have to decide how to spend. And looming over it all, under it all, around it all is the once every decade reapportionment process, which is a touchy time for lawmakers because their districts might change, and that's always uncomfortable. So that's something that's kind of inside baseball, but it's going to take up a lot of time and energy. So it's going to be a real jam-packed session. And we still don't know what the legislature, what the session is going to look like because of COVID.
Yeah.
So.
Can I jump in with a question for both of you? I'm hoping you can allay a fear I have about reapportionment. I'm really concerned about the 2020 census, because that's a lot of what the apportionment is bases its decisions on. And given it was the pandemic, given so many people were moving around, given that We had a different administration that I don't know how much they cared about numbers and their accuracy. I'm really concerned that maybe the data the reapportionment group is working with may not be as good or strong as it perhaps needs to be. And it could have long-term impacts on communities. Am I just being a Chicken Little here, or help me here?
I was really nervous about that when we were in the middle of the census. I think that since then, I've had faith in the actual people that work at the Census Bureau and the statistical modeling that they do. That does a lot of sort of projecting and patching, and it's actually called bootstrapping. Like, that's the statistical term for part of what they do. And so that I have a lot of faith in sort of making up some of the gaps. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting in the context of Vermont and Vermont census is we were allowed to essentially count second homeowners as residents. And a lot of the places where we might have seen a drop in population in Vermont were also the places that we saw permanent COVID migration to. And those are the same places where people tend to be less responsive and more distrustful of the census. So if I think about, a nice Southern Vermont hill town, like one that you're from, Olga, I think less trust of the census and random strangers knocking on the door. I think sort of a long-standing out migration in search of jobs and humans. And I also think of those are places that saw really significant influxes of COVID migrants. And so that actually all sort of balanced itself out from what I've seen so far in looking at what the numbers look like in Vermont. Windham County, for instance, lost less people than we thought we were going to.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that.
Yeah, John, is that where, and I was appointed by the speaker to be on the census counts committee. So I have been tracking this. In addition to my deep abiding love of the census, there was a time in my life where I thought I wanted to work there in the federal Census Bureau, in Washington doing the analysis. I also had a legislative role on that with Representative Gannon. John, does that match up with sort of what you've heard about the process so far?
Well, in terms of like the census, I'm glad to hear what Emily said about that, because I, shared your doubts, Olga, wondering how accurate this thing was. At this point, I don't think we have much choice but to barrel ahead, and it's going to be the basis for legislative districting for the next 10 years.
Right.
So if it worked out okay, I'm very glad to hear that. What's happened so far with the process is we have a nonpartisan commission, whatever they call it, that creates new maps based on the population information and proposes a legislative redistricting, which then is completely a suggestion. The commission has no power. The legislature does the final redrawing. And the commission did something very interesting that I think the legislature is going to immediately trash, which is to abolish multi-member districts. Right now, most Senate districts include 2, 3, 4, or even 6 senators. So that it's a larger area. It's harder for a newcomer to campaign in a larger area, especially in Chittenden County. And, we also have a lot of House districts where there are 2 members. And there's a good argument to be made that that's a harder situation for a non-incumbent. Personally, myself, I like that idea because I think multi-member districts, especially in the Senate, has amounted to incumbent protection. But I don't think the legislature is going to go for that, because it would be so dramatic a change, and it would, put so many incumbents in peril of defeat that I think they might make some minor adjustments. They have to break up Chittenden County, that's in the law, but they're not going to go with the commission's recommendation, that's for sure.
And there's this step along the way, which I between the commission's recommendations and the House and Senate committees that make the final decision, which is the Board of Civil Authorities, that look at the recommendations and then sort of make their own recommendations based on that. I was on this national democracy transparency call a few months ago with folks like me who had worked overseas on democracy work in international circles and had really reconfigured their whole career to say all these things we learned overseas about protecting democracy, we need to bring home.
Mhm.
And one of them, Vermont generally does very, very well on those things. But the one piece that they were pushing here in Vermont was this idea that our neutral board has no power whatsoever on redistricting. And I thought, well, that's not, I sort of agreed with these folks. That makes, they should have power. And then I looked at their recommendations for Brattleboro and I was like, these people have no idea how people actually live in this town. This is ridiculous. And my district barely, it was not a personal thing for me at all. We already have single seat districts in Brattleboro, which I'm eternally grateful for. I love my single seat district, though I love my other Brattleboro reps and I love collaborating with them. I think single seat districts are better for all the reasons you mentioned, John. But they really just looked at a map and cut puzzle pieces instead of thinking about how people experience community, where people feel resonant with their voting locations. There was no sense of the idea that democracy is an emotional exercise and really deeply tied to people's experiences of place and space. And so I think if we're going to give them more power, we need to also give them a little more expertise and a little more collaboration with maybe just even the boards of civil authority, because that was the recommendation for down here, which very silly. They barely changed, changed everything for no reason anyone could ascertain, because all that the Board of Civil Authority actually recommended was moving one boundary over 2 blocks, and it fixed all of our number problems. I don't know.
I mean, I'm sure being on that commission is no picnic, because you're dealing with so many numbers and so many boundaries, and they're all volunteers, and I can't imagine being on that commission. But in a way, it doesn't surprise me that an all volunteer commission with probably not a lot of staff doesn't get to drill down to the community level, and that's important. That's how districts should be, not only equal in population, but ideally somehow resonant with how people actually live and what neighborhoods are and what communities are. The only way we do that is to try to hew to town and county boundaries whenever possible, but even that is kind of more the exception than the rule because of the need to equalize population.
Mhm.
And I don't know how you get more local input or more local knowledge into this process, but it's certainly a good idea.
Mhm.
And what it means for the session, which is I think why we started talking about this,
Yeah.
is that while we're doing all of our other work, we have this recommendation looming that means that we're not going to really vote. This isn't going to pass until a couple weeks before the deadline for declaring. And so I think an election year is always a more sort of tension filled time in the legislature, but the fact that people don't even know what their districts are going to be that they might or might not be running in really is going to add to that.
And if you're thinking about running for the legislature, you won't know until very late in the process where you would be running from or what district you live in. So that's going to be make the whole running for office part of this extra fraught. And the other thing we should mention in that regard is the likelihood that we will have a shifting of the political landscape, starting with Senator Pat Leahy deciding to retire. And then, Peter Welch aiming to move up from Congress to the Senate, and then his congressional seat being open. And then that, other dominoes fall from that. If Molly Gray runs, then there's an opening for lieutenant governor. If Becca Balint runs, there's an opening for Windham County Senate, and the Senate will be looking for a new leader. So, and then other dominoes fall there. If Emily Kornheiser decides to run for Becca's seat, if she runs for Congress, then there's an opening in the legislature.
Emily Kornheiser is not running for state Senate.
No.
You heard it here.
If Sarah Coffey or Molly Burke decides to run for Senate. So it's a lot of sort of dominoes falling, and who knows exactly how they will all fall out. So it's going to be an extra complicated and interesting political year.
Mm-hmm. Do we think Scott will run for Congress?
I think he's getting tired and grouchy.
Yep.
Answers that question.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know the guy. I don't know if maybe being tired and grouchy makes him like dig in his heels and stick around longer. I have no idea. I think he's been having fun up until this point though, and it is a less fun job. And Suzanne Young left, who I think was really his anchor in a lot of ways, not his political anchor, but running government is a big job, and the governor doesn't actually do all that much of it. And it's the agency of administration that holds a lot of stuff together. And Suzanne Young had been there for a long time, and she knew her job. And so I'm curious about how much harder that makes the governor's job with her retiring.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Yeah. And I think in terms of like what Phil Scott might do next, I think the most likely thing is he'll go back to running a construction company and racing on Thunder Road. I think there is a small possibility that if there were a Senate opening not involving Pat Leahy and Peter Welch, that he might be talked into it. He would certainly get infinite backing from national Republican groups who are always anxious to pick off a solid red seat in Congress. I think there's absolutely no way he runs for the congressional seat. Go to Washington and be one of 435 people and be in a caucus with, Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't think Phil Scott is up for that. So I don't think he's going anywhere. I think if he went anywhere, maybe a tiny chance that he runs for Senate, and if Bernie retires in 2024. Okay. Small chance there, but for now, I think he's either staying put. I have heard a rumbling that he is not going to run for re-election. That's a single source. I do not necessarily believe it, but I'm at least trying to keep my mind open to the possibility. And if that happens, boy, then everything's up in the air. We'll have a bunch of Democrats running for governor, and we'll have a bunch of their seats opening up, and so it will really be turmoil time.
And what's interesting is, so when we think about the folks who we are fairly sure are running for Congress, Welch announced that he's going to run for Senate. I don't think we've had any official announcements, but we've had people essentially let it be known that they are running. When we think about those folks, and the fact that everything we do is now in our legislative work is now streamed live on YouTube for the world to watch, it means that conversations that historically have been very sort of focused on the people who are in the room and convincing and communicating with the people in the room. Occasionally, if a reporter was there, you knew they were there, and you knew that you were looking for one pull quote, not, a whole soliloquy. It changes everything now that we're on YouTube, and every moment of our debate is an opportunity for, a clip or a meme, or to be sort of demonstrating your prowess on the national level. I think that really changes what even the debate in the legislature is going to look like this year, as people are sort of gearing up to run and trying to prove their chops.
you know,
I have not heard I have no idea who's interested in running for governor. So that one will be fun, I guess.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
So Emily, as you're getting ready to go, oh, sorry, John, what's that?
I had just said the conventional wisdom is that T.J. Donovan, the Attorney General, will run for governor whenever Phil Scott leaves. And I think, you know, he has so much capital built up in Democratic Party circles that he would be hard to beat. You know, my fervent hope is that with if all these openings do happen at the top levels of our political system, that we desperately need to get more women into those positions. You know, we've got women in the sort of lower and middle levels. We're starting to get women higher up, but, you know, we've never sent a woman to Congress. We've only had one female governor. I think Molly Gray is the first female lieutenant governor, or the second, or something like that. I may be wrong about that, but
second.
it's not great. And this is looking like this next few years is looking like the sort of generational chance to make a change at the top.
Thank you. Emily, as you're getting ready to go back to at least serving in the legislature, I don't know if you're actually going to be in the state house. What's on your focus, or what's on your kind of to-do list?
Well, I'll say I've been serving in the legislature through this entire off session.
I knew as soon as those words came out of my mouth, so I'm like, she's going to correct me on that
sort
one.
of a constituent service that is all year round. I am serving on 3 summer committees, as well as sort of preparing legislation for the upcoming session. So I have been serving straight on through and happy to do it. So when we start back the new session on January 4th, are you wondering about sort of what that's going to look like from a practical perspective? Or are you wondering about what policies I'm excited about?
I'm both actually.
Okay. Where do you want me to start?
Policies.
Okay. So I'm really excited to continue investing piles of money in housing. I remain concerned that we need to be building faster in Windham County than we have the capacity to build, not just the dollar capacity, but the wastewater capacity, the building site capacity, the staffing and planning capacity. So really want to solve some of those problems and really diversify the options that we have available for affordable housing. And I mean affordable housing with a lowercase a. I think there's a place for public housing. I think there's a place for subsidized affordable housing. And I think there's a place for housing that people can afford. And I think we need all of those things across the system, as well as some regulation and I remain hopeful about regulation to really rein in the rampant housing speculation that we are continuing to see around Vermont, especially in the form of short-term rentals. So that's one thing I'm really, really excited about. I am looking forward to voting on Proposition 5, the Reproductive Justice Amendment. I don't think that will be, I think it'll be an interesting debate, but we'll pass through the House with flying colors. And I'm looking forward to just sort of standing tall and proud and saying yes on that. And it's always a topic that I really enjoy debating because it's very close to my heart. I am going to spend a lot of time, as I have this summer, on education finance reform, and we talked about the people waiting study.
That's another big thing that's on the legislature's plate. Aside from all the other things I mentioned earlier, that's going to be a huge debate.
Yeah. And I'm really hopeful that we can move the conversation around a greater reliance on income in determining what someone's property tax burden or education tax burden looks like. So that's one really heartfelt progressive move towards making our tax structure more progressive that I'm looking forward to. I'm thinking a lot about our land use, our wastewater infrastructure, how our taxes support our municipalities to be able to care for those issues. So thinking a lot about how we get more resources to towns, whether that's in the form of revenue or revolving funds or whatever that is. I'm thinking a lot about how to restructure that stuff. And then opioids. I continue to remain incredibly surprised about how hard it is to get something done on this topic. The debate around decriminalizing buprenorphine was absolutely transformative in terms of who showed up at that table and who had experienced significant loss in their communities around this. And I feel like, if nothing else, that debate should have reminded us all what is possible about what we can do here around this issue. And so I have a bunch of bills in the hopper with Selena Colburn that we have on the wall. I'm going to move a lot of them. People are dying and they don't need to. And so that's that I'm looking forward to. And I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff that I'm not naming right now because I'm still like in the thick. Our People Waiting task force report is, we're finishing the draft this week and next. Still waiting on the final report of the unemployment insurance task force that I chaired and seeing what is possible for transformation on that system. But mostly I'm really excited that we have enough money to think creatively for once, and that it's really like, it's opening up conversations with my colleagues around what's possible.
Wonderful. Hey, I'd love to talk more, but we are actually out of time.
No.
Right?
Emily has a meeting to get to, which is probably something she says a lot these days.
Exactly. I want to be cognizant of that. So I just want to quickly toast to the new session and the new year, and to hopefully more wonderful policy discussions and more wonderful results as we move forward.
I have no
So cheers.
My lipstick and pens jar. Cheers.
Emily's getting ready to get down to work, people. She even. So John, quickly, if people wanted to check out your blog, where do they find it?
Well, it's called the Vermont Political Observer, but it's the site is actually thevpo.org. If you Google Vermont Political Observer, if you can remember that, you'll get me. If you Google the VPO, you'll probably get me. I'm on Twitter pretty actively, the VPO1, because the VPO with no number was taken by the Vienna Philharmonic.
Yeah, you can't compete with that.
So I'm around. I can be found pretty easily, and yeah.
Thank you. Emily, how about you?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, and then you'll find links to all of my social media accounts, my phone number, my address, and regular announcements about how to find me in other places.
Fantastic. And if you want to check out back episodes of the Montpelier Happy Hour, you can either find us on wherever you find your podcasts, or you can go to the Montpelier Happy Hour.captivate.fm and find more episodes there. Hey, everyone, have a great weekend.